All right, this is Brandt Stickley, and he's going to talk to us today. Let's see if I can make this bigger. There we go. All right, Brandt, do you mind talking so we can see if you're loud enough? Really quick.
Yeah, test 1, 2.
All right. Let's make sure this is on. All right, one more time. Woo!
Check.
Perfect. All right, welcome to Com 101, Brandt. This is our beginning class.
All right. And so my understanding is that the idea here is to introduce COM concepts and how they've been significant to my work.
Correct.
So we'll have to start from the beginning, and that is that I first encountered Dr. Hammer's work on the first day of my acupuncture training. Literally walked into the library at the American College of Traditional Chinese Medicine in San Francisco and got this book, which I don't know if you can see, Dragon Rises, Redbird Flies by Dr. Hammer. And I read that book and realized that it contained my life's work. And shortly after that, it was suggested to me that I should study the pulse, the shen-hammer pulse, and I began doing that with Brian LaForgia, who's one of Dr. Hammer's oldest, most advanced students. And I started studying the shen-hammer pulse. About a year later, with a friend of mine, Hamilton Rote, we were working directly with Dr. Hammer. Years later, when after graduating, I went to China and worked in a hospital there, and came back from China to upstate New York, and then during that time, Dr. Hammer moved down to Florida and was invited to take a leadership role at the college, and I followed shortly thereafter and moved down to Florida and was present at the very beginnings of the college, when we were really figuring out what it means to bring Dr. Hammer's work into an educational framework. I currently teach at the National University of Natural Medicine in Portland, and I have been teaching there since 2009, so 12 years, and in that time, I've been teaching a Chinese medical psychology course based on Dr. Hammer's book, Dragon Rises, Redbird Flies. I have been teaching the material, the model in Dragon Rises, Redbird Flies since Dr. Hammer asked me to do it in about 2003. And I started out teaching that course with Dr. Hammer seated next to me as I would do it. So it was kind of an intense experience. My main interest is in exactly exploring the premise of this book, which is that psychology and Chinese medicine are congenial therapeutic partners. And also exploring how the concepts that are explored in this book and also in a lot of Dr. Hammer's work can be grounded in classical texts. My particular model is based around the Shanghanlun, which is the oldest oldest compendium of herbal formulas in the Chinese formula science. And so there's a very sophisticated model that underlies a complex but direct herbal model that meets people's circumstances very directly. And I can try to explain what I mean by that. So Dr. Hammer's work starts from a premise that's grounded in humanist psychology, and that premise is respect. And what that means is that we offer, especially our patients, an unconditional positive regard. And what that means is that we are meeting them and we are respecting them for their being alone, just for their being. The fact that they are, no matter what their vulnerabilities are, no matter what the stresses they've had, no matter how they react to those stresses, how they express their frustrations, all of these things can be held in respect and recognized as methods to try to stay intact, to make contact with life and stay intact. That's one of the core ideas in Dr. Hammer's book, contact to stay intact. And what does that mean? That means that all of our lives take place in context. One of the hallmarks of traditional thought or classical thought is that it is context rich. That means that it is aware of more aspects related to a single thing. And with a human being, that means there are so many contexts. There's the social context, the cultural context, there's the familial context, there's the ancestral context, there's the political context. All of these are contexts that transform a person's experience. Now, we can meet that person and respect them for the attempts that they're making to evolve and to grow and to move forward and to stay in contact with life as it unfolds. And that's what Dr. Hammer charges us with. In order to do that, he suggests that we have to strive to understand how our patient experiences the world. And that we can hold that gently so that a person can explore potentially an alternative pathway for that evolution, which is more in the direction of health and ease and nourishment. And Chinese medicine has a lot to offer in that regard, because Chinese medicine, if you imagine that we are, in a sense, defined by our context, that means that there's a center within us that is in contact with the periphery, and then that periphery is in contact with the environment. When we speak of the center, we're talking about all of the nourishing earth-like aspects of a human being and how those resources are brought to bear upon how we move out into the world and reach out into the world and connect to other people. And when we connect to other people appropriately, then that becomes also a source of nourishment. So you can see that that human life, even in its social context, is a quality of expansion and contraction between resources and their deployment. And that is like the breath. expanding and contracting, expanding and contracting. And that's nothing other than yin and yang, because yin and yang is expansion and contraction. It's rising up and it's descending. It's expressing itself and it's consolidating itself. And it's restoring itself. So all of those functions in the human body can be understood as movements in a direction, a movement through space in a direction. In a human body, that takes the form of a gesture. When we speak of movement, it takes a form. When we speak of yang, it is said in the Neijing that it's commanded to the yin. That means the expression has to be connected to the expression, which is actually a manifestation of time, has to express itself in space. And space and direction are movement, and movement with mass is physical gesture. And every single quality, every single process in the body, every single process in the mind, the very evolution of our consciousness, the growth of our spirit, can be described precisely as that impulse from heaven coming into form and then taking shape and then expressing itself. And those movements can be described as the 5 phases: water, wood, fire, earth, and metal. And they can also be described as the 6 conformations. The 6 conformations is a way of describing the channels. One manifestation of the 6 conformations is the channels. Do you know the names of the channels? Yeah?
Yeah, we just read them. The Xiaoyin, the Juyin, and the Yangming. Can you not hear me?
Like, well,
Can you say it
whatever.
louder?
The Xiaoyin.
Okay, right. Okay, so
We're
I can.
super beginner.
Okay. So the bottom line is that all of the concepts, everything in the human body, every aspect of human experience, from the most physical from the most physical through the mental, through the emotional, through the psychological, and through the spiritual, can be understood as a process of movement. Dr. Hammer's book talks about how that movement is an evolution of consciousness imagine from a single cell into a complex organism, like a human being, like an adult human being. That's evidence, that's an example of this kind of unfolding. So, can you see if I hold something up, can you see it?
Probably.
Yes.
Yes.
Hopefully.
Okay. So have you ever seen an image like this? Like the Chinese coins looked
Yes.
like this.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. And there's a square, and the earth is square, and heaven is round. So there's earth and within heaven. And then we can divide that into a yin sphere and a yang sphere. And all of this is moving around heaven. And why is earth in the middle? Because you're standing on the earth and you're observing nature around you. And when you observe nature around you, in the Chinese model, it said that a sage faces south. So we put the south at the top, the north at the bottom, the east over here, and the west over here. Right? So we've got on that circle, there are the 4 directions. And we could also put the 4 seasons on there as well. So you would have four seasons of winter, spring, summer, and fall. And you'd also have midnight, dawn, noon, and evening. And what are those descriptions of? Those are descriptions of the experience of time. Seasons as the experience of time. The movement of the sun is how we track time. You're standing in the center on the earth watching the sun come up in the east and move overhead and then descend in the west. That's how we know, that's how we experience time in the world. And we recognize that that moves through also through the day. There's a depth of night. It's still dark here. Well, it's just about getting to be light here in Portland. And so I can look out to the east and watch the sun rise. It's fall. So in terms of fall, we're in the descending portion of the year. So I would call the fall is associated with the west. And I'm going to turn 50 in a month or two. So I'm about halfway through my life. And so in terms of my lifespan, I'm at noon, right? I'm just past noon right now. All of those things can be placed on this circle. Midnight, winter, the depth of night, and birth and death. Because the unfolding of life occurs from a void and returns to a void. And so we would describe the whole lifespan as traversing that entire circle. So that could be 100 years of a person's life, or that could be 20 years of a person's life if they die at 20. So we've got birth on this end of this dividing line and death on the other. Now what that means is every aspect of human life, from the most basic things that happen day to day, the fact that you take in food a couple times a day, the fact that you eliminate, the fact that your heart beats on average 72 times per minute, the fact that your respiration also has a rate of speed, right, like 16 to 18, those are all expressions of time. And as expressions of time, they're intersecting with the body. So, for example, when you become anxious, the heart rate goes up and the breathing becomes faster. And it's as if you're experiencing time in a different way because your body's communicating to you in a different way. And that would mean that this energy that would be, right, so that's like movement from the adrenals The adrenals are down here in the kidney, in the water. And then all that energy is coming up here and getting trapped. All that energy from the deepest place within you is getting mobilized to come up here, and it gets trapped because of your anxious thinking. And then because the heart and the lungs are up here, those become activated. And then that sends a message back down, quite literally, sends a message back down to your kidneys and exhausts those too. So we have to ask ourselves, right, that's the terrain. That's a description of the terrain in the body. And that terrain, as we said, has its resources and it has its relationship to the environment. And in that, we have to look at, in that we can say, how well are those resources deployed when there are insults coming into the environment from different directions at different times. And one way we can look at that is, as Dr. Hammer's book does, is as a developmental cycle. So we're born, and in the first years of our lives, we start to express ourselves. We start to integrate our nervous system with our physical body, and become capable of grasping and capable of holding things and capable of speech. And that's all happening here. And then we move out into the world. And then we become active and communicate in the world, and we develop relationships in the world. And then we take those experiences and we introject them into our own sense of who we are. That's the descent of metal, is taking our experience and becoming agents of our own, agents, becoming autonomous and free. And then on the basis of that, we move back towards water. We move through this decline and back towards the moment of our death when, God willing, we're unified with the source from which we came. So anytime, anywhere that one experiences challenges, insults, and has to respond to them, there can be a bit of a vulnerability created in one of those areas. Now, all those patterns also move through, just like the other aspects of time, they also move through through our experience every day, cycling through that. So, one of the aspects, if we look to the east, one of the aspects that has to happen here is that a movement has to happen, ascend against the force of gravity. Movement has to emerge and begin to ascend, and in doing that, ascending movement has to have some force that allows it to move against the law, basically against the force of gravity to move upward. In our lives, that's represented by, in our day-to-day experience, that's represented by our ability to stand up and act and move forward. So every time that we're taking a step forward, we're saying no to gravity. So if we extend that into a person's experience, we can associate that same movement upward and outward with confounding confounding some expectation that is placed upon one, like the law of gravity. Sometimes our family structure feels as constraining and as totalizing as the law of gravity. Right? There's experiences, there's expectations upon one that you have to ultimately determine if you're going to accept them or not. Imagine how this affects one's sense of self. Imagine if you are trying to express yourself freely, and that in the process of having to express yourself, you have to say no to some kind of expectation. A common example of that is that rather than holding people with respect for their being, many people have a tendency to respect people more for their doing than their being, for their productivity versus their existence. And if a person gets the message that their value and their sense of self, and when they feel most resourced, is when they are demonstrating their proficiency in something, or they're producing something for which they can receive validation. They are exerting themselves so that they can feel whole, but that they can't rest in, therefore they can't rest in the ease of their being, but only in the activity of their doing. That's what we call like a wood yin deficient state in Dr. Hammer's model. And that would mean that on this model, in the area associated with the liver, a person can't just, right, there's the advanced quality of that, and then there's the resting quality of that. One aspect of the liver is when the eyes close, in the Suan it says, when the eyes close, which means when you rest, the blood goes back to the liver. And when the eyes open, the blood opens the eyes, the blood comes out of the liver and opens the eyes, and when it reaches the hands can grasp. When it reaches the fingers can feel. And that's a way of describing how the fullness of our liver blood circulation, the presence of that in our whole body, allows us to feel and allows us to act. But it has to have an appropriate rest as well. It has to go back to the liver, and in the liver there's the capacity for our vision to be directed inward into our own experience. So in Dr. Hammer's model, a wood yin deficient person has a hard time turning off the upward-outward movement so that they can be present in the return and the restoration of the blood going back to the liver. So imagine if that's your way of being in the world, and you're constantly moving, pushing chi out to the surface, that means that there's a vacuity of chi in the center. Now, emotionally, internally, that's like I'm looking outside at this potential threat, and internally, I'm bringing all my resources outward towards that. So, Chinese medicine is very, very simple. only one pathology in Chinese medicine. There's only one problem in Chinese medicine. And that's flowing against. You're either flowing with this unfolding easily, smoothly, and appropriately, or you're flowing against it. Flowing against it can take a couple of different forms. Flowing against can mean it's moving too quickly. Flowing against can mean it's stuck in place. And flowing against can mean it's going backwards. But everything, if as I've said, everything is a quality of movement, then the only disruption is a disruption of that movement. Now the second principle, the easy principle of Chinese medicine, is that there's only one treatment in Chinese medicine. That treatment is, if there's too much, take some away, and if there's not enough, add more. If there's too much movement, allow that, create the conditions for that to slow down. If there's no movement, create the conditions for that to be able to move. If it's moving backwards, reverting, going in the opposite direction, create the circumstances for it to go forward in a more workable and appropriate direction. Add something so that it can move forward. That's all of Chinese medicine. And if you can look at a person and you can see all of the manifestations of directional movement in them, then it's as simple, they say, as acupuncture would work like you're pulling a thorn out of your body. That's simple. Because you see the circumstances that are giving rise to this movement, and then you create another avenue for that movement to express itself more easily, with less suffering. That's all of Chinese medicine. Every single formula works to restore the terrain, to create a balance in the terrain so that it can work around the stresses. And in a way, when we're talking about time, talking about that as an expression of time, the seasons of our lives, the evolution of our being, those are all qualities of movement and qualities of time. And we're just trying to restore the appropriate relationship to time. And to do that, we look at the 5 phases. We look at 6 conformations. Now, Dr. Hammer's rich experience as a medical doctor and as a psychiatrist and as a psychoanalyst and as an early practitioner in the somatic psychology movement, and then as a practitioner of Chinese medicine, brought all of that knowledge to bear and looked at these models of how time expresses itself and saw a developmental picture of human beings that was remarkably consistent and congenial with psychology as he understood it, as his training understood it. And in that way, created this incredibly robust synthesis of Chinese medicine with humanist psychology. And that's a major part of calm. And within the shen-hammer pulse, all of these qualities all of these qualities of movement that describe how our lives unfold is present in the pulse and can be perceived in the pulse with extraordinary accuracy. We can understand a person's constitution, behavioral style, cognitive style, what causes them anxiety, what would give rise to depression in them, how they behave in relationships, what could ultimately undermine their whole structure of their psyche. All of those can be understood clearly through the pulse as movements and gestures in the human body and dynamics in the human body. And then you're perceiving that directly through your fingertips. And then it's as easy as taking a thorn out of the skin. You know exactly where to go and what to do to restore the natural expression. So if you can see that, if you can perceive that, you don't have to see it. You can feel it. You can see it. You can feel it. You can know it. You can reason it out. But if you can perceive that directly and act directly upon it, you've created a profound circumstance. Every time you treat a patient, if you are able to understand how they experience the world, as Dr. Hammer suggests, and you perceive that directly, you're meeting them in the present. And when you're meeting them in the present, you're able to recognize, in order to understand how they experience the world, you're recognizing how all of their past experiences are emerging in that moment to meet you face to face in that meeting. And when you assess and treat and you remove the obstacles to movement and you help to restore the natural quality of movement and circulation in the body, you're actually standing in the present, performing that, completely present to that process, and you're inviting the future self to come into contact with that person right there. So you've become a conduit through which past and future meet in the present. And because you've come into contact, you've helped this person to make contact to stay intact. That means that their future has the potential to unfold in a different and more healthful direction through the treatment. If you can understand it through these dynamics and see it very clearly so that the treatment matches the experience profoundly, exquisitely, you've created an avenue for that person to evolve towards a more realized sense of themselves. And think about that just in the context of if someone comes in with a cold, something as basic as somebody comes in with an upper respiratory infection. When you treat them, you are actually trying to make contact with the future self of that person that does not have those symptoms. And literally inviting that self to come and occupy the present. And that's how it's transformed. So what calm gives us is an extraordinary means to develop ourselves as perceivers and advocates and agents of change to help others do the same and become more of themselves, more fully and completely, easily and expressively free to be themselves. So that's what calm means to me. Is there any questions?
Anybody have any questions? I think they're a little bogged down. They're all like just wide-eyed over here. Yeah.
I actually do
Okay.
have a statement.
Well, so,
Oh, there's a question
Can
over
I
here.
come up?
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
Hi, my name is Sarah. I'm
Hi.
listening to you and I wanted to know if the way you're thinking would be the same thing as like frequency healing, like pulling in frequencies from the universe and from the dimensions is, you know, because you'll have a biosignature that's attached to those frequencies, and when you're talking about yourself bringing the healthy one forward and creating that self-healing, would that be kind of like the same kind of concept that you're speaking of?
that is a concept, that's exactly the kind of concept that I'm speaking of, and that's exactly the kind of concept that Chinese medicine is truly based on.
Awesome.
If you're interested in that subject, there's an incredible book called Humming with Elephants,
Okay.
and it's a translation of Su Wen chapter 5 in the from the Neijing, the Yellow Emperor's inner scripture, the Neijing, and within that, part of that is the Su Wen. The 5th chapter of the Su Wen describes all of the ways in which those qualities of resonance inform the human body and the human spirit.
Right.
It's all about resonance.
Perfect. That's exactly my line of thinking. Thank you for
Right.
connecting the two.
Anyone else? Anyone else have any questions? Thank you so much, Brandt, for coming. We appreciate you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, they're saying thank you. I don't know if you can hear them or not.
I can see him.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I come back every year and teach. I come back every year and teach exactly a course based on Dr. Hammer's book. I've done it every year except for one since 2003. In 2009, I didn't come back because I had just moved to Portland at that time. But I teach this material. And, you know, there's only a handful of places where you can learn this, and you're in one of them. You're in the hotbed of it. And this has been the most, this book and Dr. Hammer and Dr. Hammer's work has given me my life. I couldn't practice the way I practice without it. It's the cornerstone of everything I do. Every thought that I have that I can connect, and how I can connect them to the Neijing is informed by my understanding as I've learned it from Dr. Hammer. It's a profound gift. And you're very fortunate, you're lucky to be there. It's amazing. All right, well, so, you know, you can, if any questions come up for you from this, you're welcome to contact me via email. That's fine. You can also go to my website, brandtstickley.com, and contact me through that. If you're at the beginning of your journey of learning about Chinese medicine and becoming practitioners of Chinese medicine, in a sense I envy you, because you are at the beginning of a profound potential period of growth. it's going to change you, and it's going to change you more into who you are. And that's a high project. All right, I think that's the end.
Okay. Thank you so much, Brandt.
Thank you.
All right. Have a great day, everybody.
Okay. All right, guys, you can go ahead and take a 10-minute break really quickly. Try to come back